The morning mist clung to Powder River like the ghosts of dead men, and Samuel Crawford knew something about ghosts. At 62, he had buried more friends than most men could count, but standing beside his son David's grave 3 months after the funeral, he felt the weight of failure pressing against his chest like a Confederate bayonet. The headstone read David Michael Crawford, beloved husband and son, 1856 to 1884. What it didn't say was that David had been murdered. What it couldn't say was that Sam had failed to protect the one person who mattered most in a world that had already taken too much from him. Behind him, the ranch stretched across 2,400 acres of Wyoming territory, every fence post and water trough built with his own hands after he'd limped home from Appomattox with a Union pension and a body full of Confederate lead. The Bighorn Mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the dawn sky, their snow-capped peaks catching the first light of what promised to be another hard day in a season that had already delivered more hardship than any reasonable man should be expected to bear. Belle emerged from the ranch house, her silhouette framed against the yellow glow of the kitchen window where she had been preparing breakfast with the methodical precision of a woman who understood that routine was sometimes the only thing standing between sanity and despair. Even at a distance, Sam could see the subtle curve of her belly beneath her black morning dress. 4 months along, carrying David's child, carrying the future of the Crawford name. In the eyes of territorial law, she was just another widow with questionable claim to property that might be better managed by men who understood the complexities of land ownership and cattle ranching. That was the first problem. The second problem was Clayton Voss. Sam had fought at Gettysburg, Antietam, and a dozen other battlefields where the ground ran red with American blood spilled in service of principles that seemed increasingly abstract with each passing year. He'd seen men die for country, for freedom, for nothing more than the stubbornness of generals who couldn't admit their strategic mistakes. But he'd never faced an enemy quite like Voss, a man who killed with lawyers and banknotes instead of rifles and bayonets, who destroyed lives with the same casual efficiency that other men used to swat flies. The letter had arrived yesterday, delivered by a nervous postal clerk who'd refused to meet Sam's eyes and had stammered apologies as if the message he carried was somehow his fault. Heavy paper, expensive ink, the kind of correspondence that came from men who wore suits instead of working clothes and who measured their worth in other men's suffering rather than in honest labor. Sam pulled the letter from his coat pocket now, the paper crackling in the morning cold like dried leaves or old bones. The wind carried with it the scent of sage and pine from the distant mountains, mixing with the earthier smells of hay and horses that had defined his life for the past 18 years. Dear Mr. Crawford, the letter began, written in the precise script of a professional clerk and signed by one Harrison Blackwood, attorney at law, Denver, Colorado. It has come to our attention that your late son, David Crawford, owed a substantial debt to our client, Mr. Clayton Voss, in the amount of $3,000 borrowed against future cattle sales with the Crawford Ranch as collateral for said loan. $3,000. More money than most men saw in 5 years of backbreaking work, more than Sam had spent building the entire ranch from raw wilderness into the productive operation it had become. The letter went on to explain, in language designed to sound both official and inevitable, that payment was due within 30 days of receipt, or the ranch would be subject to immediate foreclosure proceedings under territorial statutes governing debt recovery and property seizure. Sam folded the letter carefully, his weathered fingers trembling not from cold, but from a rage so pure and focused that it reminded him of those moments in battle when everything became crystalline clear and a man understood exactly what needed to be done to survive. David had been many things during his 28 years of life. Foolish sometimes, headstrong always, too quick to trust people who didn't deserve trust, and too slow to see danger until it was breathing down his neck like a predator in the wilderness. But David had never been a man to borrow money he couldn't repay. More than that, David had never mentioned any debt to Clayton Voss, not once in all the evenings they'd spent sitting on the ranch house porch planning the next season's cattle drive or discussing improvements to the irrigation system Sam had learned to build during his time with the Army Corps of Engineers. David told his father everything that mattered, shared every worry about drought or disease or market prices that kept ranchers awake during the long Wyoming nights, when the wind howled down from the mountains like the voices of angry spirits. Belle approached across the morning grass, her boots leaving dark prints in the dew that would disappear as soon as the sun climbed high enough to burn away the moisture. She moved carefully now, protecting the life growing inside her with the instinctive caution of a woman who understood that the frontier was no place for careless gestures or unnecessary risks. But Sam could see the steel in her spine that had attracted David in the first place. The quiet strength that spoke of a woman raised to understand that the land demanded courage from those who would claim it as their own. "You're reading that letter again," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that spoke of education back east, of a family that had possessed books as well as cattle, and who had taught their children that knowledge was a weapon as valuable as any gun. "I'm trying to understand how a man borrows $3,000 without his father knowing about it," Sam replied, tucking the letter back into his coat pocket, where it seemed to burn against his chest like a brand. "David told me about every fence that needed mending, every head of cattle that went missing, every penny he spent on feed and supplies during bad weather. But somehow he forgot to mention a debt that could cost us everything we've built." Belle placed her hand on Sam's arm, her touch gentle but insistent in the way that women had of conveying strength through tenderness. "Maybe because he didn't borrow any money. Maybe because someone is lying and they're counting on us being too grief-stricken or too intimidated to fight back." The thought had occurred to Sam, circling around the edges of his consciousness like a wolf stalking a campfire. But hearing Belle say it aloud gave it weight and substance, the kind of reality that demanded action rather than passive acceptance. He'd spent enough time around dishonest men during the war to recognize the particular smell of deception, and this letter reeked of it like a corpse left too long in the sun. "The paper looks legitimate," he said, though even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice like smoke seeping through the cracks in a poorly built chimney. "The letterhead, the seal, even the signature looks professional enough to fool most people." "Paper can be forged," Belle replied with the quiet confidence of a woman who had spent her childhood around men who made their living through careful observation and attention to detail. "David showed me some of his grandfather's letters from the war. You wrote to him about men who forged discharge papers, sold fake land grants to desperate families who didn't know any better. If a man can forge government documents during wartime, he can certainly forge a private debt agreement during peacetime." Sam felt something shift inside his chest, a familiar tightening that he remembered from those moments before battle, when everything hung in the balance and a single decision could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between coming home and dying in some forgotten field thousands of miles from everyone who mattered. Belle was right, of course. During the war, he'd encountered forged papers so convincing that even experienced officers had been fooled by them, documents that had cost good men their lives and their honor because they trusted in the integrity of official-looking seals and signatures. But recognizing forgery required expertise, and more than that, it required proof that would stand up in a territorial court where justice was often less important than political connections and financial influence. Clayton Voss owned half the territorial legislature and had his fingers in more judicial pockets than a successful pickpocket at a county fair. "We'll need more than suspicion to fight this in court," he said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had learned through bitter experience that being right was often less important than being powerful. Especially against Clayton Voss. That man has more influence in Cheyenne than the territorial governor, and he's not shy about using it when someone gets in his way. Belle's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sam saw something of David in her expression, a stubborn determination that had been both his son's greatest strength and, ultimately, his fatal weakness. It was the kind of resolve that made people do foolish, heroic things, that drove them to stand up against impossible odds because surrendering felt like a betrayal of everything they believed about right and wrong. "Then we don't fight it in court," she said, her voice carrying the quiet intensity that Sam had learned to associate with dangerous ideas and desperate measures. "We fight it the way you fought the Confederates during the war. We gather intelligence, we find the truth, and we expose our enemies for what they really are before they can destroy us completely." Sam looked at his daughter-in-law with new respect, seeing in her not just the grieving widow he had been trying to protect, but a woman who understood the realities of warfare better than most men who had actually carried rifles into battle. Most women in her condition would be focused entirely on protecting their unborn child, on finding safety and security in an uncertain world where violence was always closer than comfort. But Belle was talking about war, and she was right to do so. Because this was war, fought with different weapons than the conflict that had defined Sam's youth, but no less deadly than the battles he had survived in Virginia and Pennsylvania. The stakes were just as high, the consequences just as permanent, and the need for victory just as absolute. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Three riders emerging from the morning mist like specters materializing from the boundary between dreams and waking nightmares. Their horses moved at the deliberate pace of men who owned the land they rode across, who had never known the uncertainty of wondering whether they would be welcome wherever their travels might take them. Sam recognized the lead rider immediately. Clayton Voss himself, a man whose reputation stretched from Wyoming to Texas like a shadow cast by a tall tree under the harsh light of a desert sun. Voss sat his horse like a general surveying conquered territory, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as a man who had never known the honest exhaustion of physical labor or the satisfaction that came from building something useful with his own hands. Behind him rode two of his men, cowboys whose hard faces and low-slung gun belts suggested they were paid for considerably more than just working cattle or mending fences. These were the kind of men who solved problems with violence, who understood that intimidation was often more effective than negotiation when it came to getting what their employer wanted. "Morning, Crawford," Voss called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of a man educated in Eastern schools, where they taught young gentlemen that breeding and money were more important than character or competence. "Beautiful day for reflecting on life's uncertainties, don't you think?" Sam stepped forward, positioning himself between Voss and Belle, with the instinctive protectiveness of a man who had spent too many years watching good people suffer at the hands of those who confuse power with righteousness. His hand rested casually on the Colt revolver he'd carried since his Shiloh, the weapon that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember during 4 years of brutal warfare. "It's a beautiful day for minding your own business, Voss," Sam replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from decades of command responsibility and the absolute certainty that some principles were worth dying for. "Which last I checked didn't include trespassing on my property." Voss smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes, which remained as cold and calculating as a snake's. It was the kind of smile that predators use just before they struck, designed to create a false sense of security in their victims while they position themselves for maximum advantage. "Actually, that's where you might be mistaken, my friend," Voss said, the false familiarity in his tone making Sam's skin crawl like insects walking across his grave. "You see, I've recently come into possession of certain financial obligations that concern this ranch quite directly. Debts incurred by your late son, may he rest in peace, and may God have mercy on his poor soul." "David never borrowed money from you," Belle said, stepping out from behind Sam despite his protective gesture, her voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that came from intimate knowledge rather than hopeful speculation. "He would have told us about any business dealings he had, especially ones involving that kind of money." "Would he, my dear?" Voss asked, his gaze moving to Belle's midsection with deliberate insult, the kind of calculated disrespect designed to provoke an emotional response that could be used to justify escalation. "Young men often make foolish decisions when they're trying to provide for expanding families. Pride keeps them from confessing their mistakes to their elders, especially when those mistakes involve more money than they can afford to lose." Sam felt his hand tighten on his gun. 40 years of surviving dangerous situations warring with the immediate urge to put a bullet through Clayton Voss's brain and end this threat before it could grow any larger. But experience had taught him the value of patience, the importance of understanding an enemy's strategy before choosing the battlefield where victory or defeat would be decided. Voss wanted a reaction, wanted an excuse to escalate the situation in a way that would justify whatever violence he was planning to use. Better to gather information, to understand the scope of the threat they were facing, than to give their enemy the advantage of choosing when and how this conflict would be resolved. "What kind of business did David supposedly have with you?" Sam asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the rage burning in his chest like a coal fire that had been banked but never extinguished. "Cattle futures," Voss replied smoothly, the answer coming so quickly that it was obviously rehearsed, polished through repetition until it sounded almost believable to anyone who didn't know the people involved. David came to me last spring worried about drought affecting his herd. I offered to advance him money against future beef sales, enough to see him through a difficult season. Standard business practice among progressive ranchers who understand the modern realities of agricultural commerce. The lie was smooth and professional, delivered with the confidence of a man who had told it many times before and had never been successfully challenged. But Sam had heard enough lies during the war to recognize them, and this one had the particular quality of a story prepared in advance, designed to sound plausible to people who didn't know the characters involved well enough to spot the inconsistencies. David had indeed been worried about drought last spring, but his solution had been to dig additional irrigation channels and negotiate with upstream neighbors for water rights, not to borrow money from a man he distrusted on principle. More than that, David had spent considerable time that spring warning other ranchers about Voss's business practices, advising them to be wary of any deals that seemed too good to be true. "You have documentation of this supposed agreement?" Sam asked, knowing that Voss would have prepared for exactly this question. Voss reached into his coat pocket with theatrical deliberation, producing a folded paper that he extended towards Sam with the kind of exaggerated courtesy that was really just another form of mockery. "Signed by David himself, witnessed by two of my most trusted associates. All quite legal and binding, I assure you, prepared according to territorial statutes governing private lending agreements." Sam took the document, unfolding it carefully while keeping his eyes on Voss and his men, aware that this moment of distraction could be used against him if he wasn't careful. The paper looked official enough, heavy stock with an embossed letterhead that would have impressed most people who didn't know what to look for in forged documents. But as he read the terms of the supposed agreement, several details jumped out at him that made no sense to anyone who knew David's character and habits. The agreement was dated April 15th, 1884, a date that Sam remembered clearly because it had been David's 28th birthday. They had spent the entire day together branding new calves and mending winter-damaged fences, working from dawn until well after sunset without David ever leaving the ranch property. More than that, the signature looked wrong in subtle ways that only someone who had watched David learn to write would notice. David had been taught penmanship by his mother, a school teacher from Massachusetts who had insisted on proper form and elegant flourishes. David's signature always included a distinctive loop on the capital D, a habit he had developed as a child and never abandoned even as an adult. This signature lacked that loop entirely, suggesting it had been copied by someone who could reproduce the general shape of David's name, but hadn't noticed the small personal touches that made each person's handwriting unique. "This is a forgery," Sam said quietly, folding the paper and handing it back to Voss with the kind of casual dismissal that he knew would sting a man accustomed to having his authority accepted without question. "That's a serious accusation, Crawford," Voss replied, though Sam noticed a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the charge had hit closer to home than he wanted to admit, the kind that could land a man in considerable legal trouble if he can't prove what he's saying. "Not as much trouble as the man who forged it will be in when the truth comes out," Sam replied, allowing a hint of the violence he was capable of to creep into his voice, especially when that man gets careless about details that any father would notice immediately. For just a moment, something flickered in Voss's eyes, a flash of uncertainty that told Sam his shot had hit home and drawn blood. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold confidence of a man who had survived by never showing weakness to his enemies, no matter how accurate their attacks might be. "Territorial courts don't generally take the word of grieving fathers over properly witnessed legal documents," Voss said, regaining his composure with the practiced ease of a professional liar. "But I'm not an unreasonable man, Crawford. I understand the tragic circumstances you're facing, and I'm prepared to be generous in my settlement terms." "What kind of settlement?" Belle asked, though Sam could hear the anger building in her voice like steam pressure in a locomotive boiler. $1,200, cash money, and I'll consider the debt satisfied in full," Voss replied with the magnanimous air of a man making a generous concession. "David's unfortunate death certainly wasn't his fault, after all, and I'm willing to absorb some financial loss in the interest of Christian charity and neighborly compassion." $1,200, still more money than Sam had ever possessed at one time, but less than half of the original claim and a fraction of what the ranch was actually worth. It was the kind of offer that might tempt a desperate widow who didn't understand the true value of what she was being asked to surrender. And Sam realized that was exactly what Voss was counting on. He was betting that grief and fear would cloud Belle's judgment, that the pressure of impending motherhood would make her willing to accept any settlement bond that promised immediate relief from uncertainty and conflict. "We need time to consider your generous offer," Sam said carefully, the words tasting like poison in his mouth, but necessary to buy them the time they needed to plan their right response. Of course," Voss replied with false understanding. "These are weighty matters, not to be decided hastily by people who are still processing their grief. Take all the time you need to reach the right decision." He gathered his reins, preparing to leave, but his next words carried the unmistakable weight of threat despite their reasonable tone. "I'll expect your answer within the week, Crawford. After that, I'm afraid I'll be forced to pursue other remedies available to me under territorial law. Legal remedies that might be considerably less pleasant for everyone involved." The threat hung in the morning air like gunsmoke as Voss and his men rode away, their horses disappearing into the same mist that had concealed their approach. Sam watched them go, his mind already working through the implications of what had just happened and the limited options available to them. "He's not going to wait a week," Belle said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of a woman who understood predators well enough to recognize when they were preparing to strike. "No," Sam agreed, his hand still resting on his gun, even though the immediate danger had passed. "Men like Voss don't make threats they don't intend to follow through on. And they don't ride out to remote ranches just to discuss business arrangements that could be handled through lawyers and official correspondence." Belle placed her hand protectively over her belly, a gesture that reminded Sam of everything he had to lose and everything he was fighting to protect. "What do we do now?" Sam looked out across the land he had carved from wilderness, through 18 years of backbreaking labor, the legacy he had intended to pass to David and David's children after him. Every acre represented sacrifice and determination. Every building had been constructed with his own hands, using skills learned during his service with the Army Corps of Engineers. The irrigation channels that brought water from the mountain streams followed precise grades he had calculated using surveying techniques learned under fire in Virginia. The barn had been built according to specifications he had memorized from military engineering manuals. Even the placement of the ranch house had been chosen for its defensive advantages, positioned to offer clear lines of sight in all directions while remaining protected from the worst of the mountain weather. This wasn't just property in any legal sense. This was a testament to what a man could accomplish with determination, skill, and the willingness to endure whatever hardships the frontier demanded from those who would make it their home. "We fight," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "But not the way Voss expects us to fight. He's counting on us being isolated, desperate, willing to accept whatever terms he offers because we don't have any other choice." "But we do have other choices?" Sam nodded slowly, his mind reaching back across the decades to lessons learned during 4 years of brutal warfare, strategies and tactics that had kept him alive when other men died because they failed to understand the true nature of the conflict they were fighting. "Voss thinks this is about money and legal documents," Sam said. "But he's wrong. This is about something much more fundamental than financial obligations or property rights. This is about whether good people can live in peace or whether they'll be driven out by those who prefer chaos to order." Belle studied his face with the intensity of a woman trying to read her own future in another person's expressions. "You think David was murdered, don't you?" "I know David was murdered," Sam replied with the absolute certainty that came from understanding enemies well enough to predict their behavior. "Maybe not with a gun or a knife, but murdered all the same. Men don't die of natural causes at 28 when they're healthy and strong, and in the way of someone like Clayton Voss." The sun had risen fully now, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the Crawford Ranch in sharp detail. Cattle grazed peacefully in distant pastures, unaware that their world was about to change in ways that would determine whether they lived or died. The windmill turned steadily in the mountain breeze, pumping water that might soon belong to other men if this war was lost. It looked peaceful, pastoral, the kind of scene that might grace the pages of an Eastern magazine article about the romance of frontier life. But Sam knew better than most men, That peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered by those who saw other people's accomplishments as obstacles to their own ambitions. "There's something else," Belle said, her voice carrying a note of hesitation that made Sam look at her more closely. "Something I haven't told you about David and the days before he died." Sam felt his chest tighten with apprehension. After 37 years of marriage and 28 years of fatherhood, he had learned that conversations beginning with those words rarely brought good news. "What is it?" Belle glanced toward the ranch house, as if making sure they couldn't be overheard by invisible enemies who might be listening from hiding places among the buildings her husband had constructed with such care and pride. "The night before he died, David was upset about something," she said, moving closer to Sam so she could speak more quietly. "He'd been reading through some papers, documents he kept in a locked wooden box in our bedroom. When I asked him about it, he said he'd discovered something that was going to change everything." "What kind of documents?" "I don't know exactly," Belle admitted with obvious frustration. "He wouldn't tell me the details, said it was too dangerous for me to know until he could figure out what to do about what he'd learned. But he was frightened, Sam, really frightened, in a way I'd never seen before." Sam felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place, forming a picture that was both clearer and more dangerous than he had imagined. David hadn't just been an obstacle to Voss's immediate plans for the ranch. He had been a direct threat to something much larger, something that Voss couldn't afford to have exposed. Did he say anything else? Any hint about what kind of information he'd found? Belle closed her eyes, clearly trying to remember details that fear and grief had made fuzzy and uncertain. "He said that Voss had been lying about more than just cattle prices. He said there were other people involved, people with influence in territorial government who had been helping Voss steal land from families who couldn't fight back." "Did he mention any names?" "Just one," Belle said, opening her eyes to meet Sam's gaze directly. "Sheriff Miller. David said Miller had been taking money from Voss for at least 2 years, helping him manufacture legal justifications for seizing property from people who got in his way." Sam felt cold understanding wash over him like winter water. If Sheriff Miller was corrupt, then they couldn't count on law enforcement for protection. Worse than that, Miller would be actively working against them, using his official authority to help Voss achieve his goals through legal channels that would be almost impossible to challenge. "Where is this box now?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "David hid it somewhere the night before he died," Belle said. "Somewhere he thought would be safe from anyone who might come looking for it. But he died before he could tell me where." Sam closed his eyes and let his memory drift back across the years to David's childhood, trying to think like a boy who had grown up on this ranch and knew every hiding place it offered. Where would David have put something that needed to be protected from enemies who might search the house and barn? The answer came to him suddenly, with the clarity that sometimes emerged from the intersection of desperation and inspiration. The old root cellar behind the main barn, the place where Sam had taught David to store winter vegetables and preserve meat during the hot summer months when keeping food fresh was a constant challenge. It was hidden, defensible if necessary, and most importantly, it was connected to David's earliest memories of learning to be a rancher under his father's guidance. If David had wanted to leave Sam a message, a clue that only his father would understand, the root cellar would have been the perfect choice. "I think I know where to look," Sam said, feeling the first stirring of hope he had experienced since reading Voss's forged letter. "But first we need to get you somewhere safe. If David really did find evidence that could destroy Voss's entire operation, then you're in more danger than either of us realized." Belle's jaw set in the stubborn line that reminded Sam painfully of his son's expression when David had made up his mind about something important. "I'm not running away from this fight, Sam. This ranch belongs to my child as much as it belonged to David. If we run now, we'll be running for the rest of our lives." Sam looked at his daughter-in-law with a mixture of admiration and frustration. She was right, and of course, but being right didn't make her safe from men who solved their problems with violence rather than negotiation. In war, he had learned that courage without strategy was just another word for getting killed, and strategy without adequate support was a recipe for disaster. "Then we need professional help," he said finally. "The kind of help that knows how to fight men like Voss and win." "What kind of help?" Sam felt his memory reaching back across the decades to a muddy field in Pennsylvania, where a young Texas Ranger had saved his life during the chaos of Pickett's charge. Thomas McKenna, a man who had traded his badge for a rifle when circumstances demanded it, but who had never lost his sense of honor, even when everything else in the world seemed to be falling apart. "An old friend," Sam said, the words carrying more weight than Bell could possibly understand. "Someone who knows about fighting hopeless battles and finding ways to win them anyway." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and pine from the distant mountains, where snow was already beginning to accumulate, despite the fact that winter was still weeks away. Somewhere in those peaks, if Thomas McKenna was still alive, was the only man Sam trusted to help him protect what remained of his family. But first, he needed to find David's hidden evidence. He needed to understand exactly what his son had discovered and why that information had been worth killing for. Only then could he plan a campaign worthy of the stakes involved, a strategy that would either destroy Clayton Voss completely or see them all destroyed in the attempt. Only then could he begin to repay the debt owed for David's murder and ensure that his grandchild would inherit something more valuable than the fear that had killed its father. As Bell headed back toward the ranch house to prepare for whatever came next, Sam stood alone beside his son's grave, feeling the weight of promise and responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The morning sun was warm on his face, but his hand remained close to the Colt revolver that had carried him through 4 years of war and 18 years of building something worth defending. "I'm going to find the truth, son," he said quietly, his words disappearing into the vast Wyoming sky like smoke from a dying campfire. "And when I do, Clayton Voss is going to learn that some debts can never be forgiven, and some men don't die as easily as he thinks they do." The promise hung in the clear mountain air like a prayer offered to whatever gods watched over fathers and their children. And somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled high above the valley, hunting for prey that had no idea death was approaching on silent wings. The journey to Colorado took Sam Crawford 3 days of hard riding through terrain that had claimed the lives of better men than him during his younger years. His horse, a sturdy Morgan mare named Justice that he'd raised from a foal, carried him through country that shifted from Wyoming's rolling grasslands to Colorado's jagged mountain passes, with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that understood the difference between challenging ground and genuinely dangerous territory. At 62, Sam felt every mile in his bones, each jarring impact of hoof against stone, reminding him that his body was no longer the weapon it had been during the war. But pain was just another enemy to be endured, and he'd learned long ago that the secret to surviving discomfort was to acknowledge it without letting it control his decisions or slow his progress toward objectives that mattered more than personal convenience. The Rocky Mountains loomed ahead like the ramparts of some impossible fortress, their snow-covered peaks catching the late October sun and throwing it back in brilliant sheets of light that could blind a man if he wasn't careful about when and where he looked. Sam had crossed these mountains twice before, once immediately after the war, when both he and Tom McKenna were still trying to forget what they had seen at places like Gettysburg and Antietam, and again 10 years later when Tom's wife had died of consumption and left him alone in a wilderness that seemed determined to swallow every trace of human civilization. Each time, the country had seemed more remote, more hostile to the idea that men could carve out permanent settlements in places where winter lasted 8 months, and summer was just a brief intermission between periods of genuine hardship. But Tom had chosen this isolation deliberately, Sam knew, the way some men chose whiskey or religion as buffers against memories that refused to fade with the passing of time. Tom McKenna's cabin sat in a valley so remote that most territorial maps didn't bother to include it, accessible only through a series of switchback trails that would challenge an experienced mountaineer and kill an amateur outright. Sam found it just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, smoke rising from the stone chimney in a thin gray line that spoke of warmth and shelter after 3 days of sleeping on ground that grew harder and colder with each passing night. He dismounted near a split-rail fence that enclosed a small corral where 2 horses grazed with the kind of peaceful contentment that suggested they'd never known hunger or fear. One was a paint mare he recognized from his previous visits, a reliable mountain horse with the intelligence to find her way home through blizzards that would confuse more pampered animals. The other was a black stallion with the kind of muscular build that spoke of careful breeding and expensive feed. The sort of horse that a man acquired when he needed speed and endurance more than he worried about the cost. The cabin door opened before Sam could dismount completely, and Tom McKenna stepped onto the narrow porch with a Winchester rifle cradled casually in his arms. At 58, Tom moved with the careful precision of a man whose survival had always depended on being faster and smarter than his enemies. Every gesture calculated to provide maximum advantage in situations where a moment's hesitation could mean the difference between living and dying. His hair had gone completely gray since Sam's last visit, but his eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most effective Texas Rangers in the service's history. Those eyes missed nothing, cataloging details about Sam's appearance, his horse's condition, and the way he carried himself with the automatic thoroughness of a professional who had learned never to trust first impressions or obvious explanations. "Sam Crawford," Tom said, lowering his rifle but not setting it aside entirely, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. "Either you're here because you missed my charming personality and stimulating conversation, or someone's about to die in ways that will require my particular expertise." "Someone already has died," Sam replied, dismounting slowly to give his protesting joints time to adjust and to demonstrate that he posed no immediate threat. "My son David. 3 months ago, under circumstances that don't add up to anything resembling natural causes." Tom's expression shifted immediately from wariness to genuine sympathy, the transformation so complete that it reminded Sam of why he had ridden 3 days through dangerous country to find this particular man. Beneath the professional caution and hard-earned cynicism, Tom McKenna remained fundamentally decent, the kind of person who understood that some losses cut too deep for casual comfort or easy platitudes. He leaned the Winchester against the cabin wall and stepped forward to grip Sam's shoulder with the kind of firm contact that said more than words ever could, a gesture of solidarity between men who had shared enough genuine hardship to understand the weight of real grief. "I'm sorry, Sam," Tom said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made criminals across Texas think twice before crossing his path. "David was a good boy who grew up to be a better man. What happened to him?" "That's a long story," Sam said, accepting Tom's gesture of support while noting the way his old friend's eyes continued to scan the surrounding terrain for potential threats. "And most of it doesn't make sense yet, which is why I need someone who's good at making sense of things that other people prefer to keep confusing." Tom studied Sam's face with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades reading truth in other men's expressions, looking for the subtle tells that revealed whether someone was lying, frightened, or simply overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. Whatever he saw there was enough to convince him that this wasn't a social call or a request for sympathy. "Come inside," he said finally, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Coffee's hot, and you look like you've been riding harder than a man your age should be riding without good reason." The cabin's interior reflected Tom's background as both lawman and soldier, spartanly furnished but scrupulously organized according to principles that prioritize function over comfort. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth surrounded by hand-hewn furniture that spoke of long winter evenings spent in careful craftsmanship. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes on law, military history, and tactical strategy that revealed the mind of a man who believed that knowledge was just another form of weapon. On the mantel above the fireplace, Sam noticed a photograph he hadn't seen during his previous visits, a wedding portrait of a young Tom McKenna and a beautiful dark-haired woman who must have been his late wife. The image was positioned where Tom could see it from anywhere in the main room, a constant reminder of what he had lost and why he had chosen to retreat from a world that took more than it gave. Tom poured coffee from a pot that had been warming beside the fire, handing Sam a cup before settling into a worn leather chair that positioned him with a clear view of both the door and the single window that faced the valley approach. Even in his own home, surrounded by walls he had built with his own hands, Tom McKenna remained ready for trouble. "Now," Tom said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him effective as both ranger and soldier, "tell me about David and whatever bastard was stupid enough to kill a Crawford." Sam sipped his coffee, grateful for its warmth and the few moments it gave him to organize thoughts that had been churning through his mind for 3 days of hard travel. Where did he begin? With David's mysterious death that looked natural but felt wrong? With Clayton Voss's forged documents that were sophisticated enough to fool a territorial court? With Belle's pregnancy and the legal complications that made her vulnerable to men who preferred to settle disputes with violence rather than honest negotiation? David died of what the territorial doctor called natural causes, Sam said finally, choosing to start with facts rather than suspicions. Heart failure, sudden and unexpected, in a healthy 28-year-old man who'd never shown signs of illness. Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, the expression of a man who had investigated enough suspicious deaths to recognize the pattern when someone tried to make murder look like misfortune. But you don't believe it was natural, or you wouldn't have ridden 3 days to ask for my help. It's that 3 months after the funeral, a cattle baron named Clayton Voss produces documents claiming David owed him $3,000, Sam continued, watching Tom's face for signs of recognition. Documents that are obviously forged, but sophisticated enough to fool a territorial court if it comes to that. Voss, Tom repeated, his voice carrying a note of recognition that made Sam look at him more closely. The name had hit home in ways that suggested personal knowledge rather than casual familiarity. Clayton Voss out of Wyoming territory? You know him. Tom set down his coffee cup and walked to one of the bookshelves, running his finger along the spines until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out a leather-bound ledger, the kind that rangers use to keep track of wanted men and ongoing investigations that might take years to resolve satisfactorily. Clayton Voss, Tom read aloud, flipping through pages filled with his own careful handwriting. Detailed observations recorded in the precise script of a man who understood that small details often made the difference between conviction and acquittal. Born 1839 in Missouri, moved to Texas in 1865 with carpetbagger money and political connections that protected him from consequences that would have destroyed lesser men. Sam felt his chest tighten as pieces of the puzzle began forming a clearer picture, one that was considerably more dangerous than he had originally imagined. What was he suspected of in Texas? Cattle rustling, land fraud, intimidation, and at least 2 murders that I could never prove but knew in my bones he was responsible for, Tom said, his voice carrying the frustration of a lawman who had been forced to watch guilty men walk free because the legal system protected the wealthy and connected better than it served justice. But he was too smart to get caught, too well connected to be prosecuted effectively, and too careful to leave evidence that would stand up in court. What kind of operation was he running? Tom closed the ledger with more force than necessary, the sounds sharp in the cabin's quiet interior like a gunshot echoing off mountain walls. Land acquisition through systematic intimidation and legal manipulation. He would target small ranchers, usually recent widows or families with questionable title to their property, then manufacture legal complications that force them to sell at prices far below market value. That's exactly what he's doing to Belle, Sam said, feeling pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. My daughter-in-law, she's 4 months pregnant, and according to territorial law, her claim to the ranch is questionable at best. How questionable? Sam rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of legal complications that seemed designed to protect everyone except the people who actually needed protection. David never formally adopted her into the family name through territorial registration. They were married in a civil ceremony that may not be recognized by territorial courts if challenged by someone with expensive lawyers. And women's property rights in Wyoming are progressive by Eastern standards, but still limited when it comes to inherited land with unclear chain of title. Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the dancing flames might reveal some solution to problems that had been deliberately designed to be insoluble for people without political influence or unlimited financial resources. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the grim certainty of a man who had seen this particular tragedy played out too many times before. He's going to kill her, Tom said simply, the words delivered without emotion but carrying absolute conviction. Maybe not right away, maybe not obviously enough to attract federal attention, but eventually. Voss doesn't leave loose ends, and a pregnant widow with any legitimate claim to valuable land represents exactly the kind of complication he can't afford to ignore. The words hit Sam like a physical blow, confirming fears he had been trying not to acknowledge even to himself. That's why I'm here, Tom. I can't protect her alone, and I can't trust territorial law to do what's right when the people enforcing it are either corrupt or too intimidated to stand up to men like Voss. What makes you think I'm still in the business of fighting other people's battles? Sam looked around the cabin again, taking in the isolation, the military precision of its organization, the careful positioning of weapons within easy reach of any location where Tom might be sitting or sleeping. This wasn't the home of a man who had found peace in retirement. This was the refuge of a warrior who was still fighting, even if his enemies had changed and his battlefield had shifted to more personal territory. Because you wouldn't have kept that ledger if you thought the war was over, Sam said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who recognized a kindred spirit. And because you wouldn't have chosen the most defensible position in Colorado if you thought you were safe from old enemies who might someday decide to finish what they started. Tom smiled for the first time since Sam's arrival, an expression that contained no warmth but considerable admiration for his old friend's perceptive abilities. It was the kind of smile that predators shared when they recognized another predator. Acknowledgement of mutual understanding about the true nature of survival in a world where the strong preyed on the weak unless someone was willing to stand up and fight back. Voss cost me my ranch in Texas, Tom said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a man who had spent a decade nursing grievances that time had failed to heal. Not through forged documents or legal maneuvering, but through something much simpler and more direct. Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado mountain air. What happened? He burned it down in the middle of the night, along with everything else I had built in 20 years of honest work, Tom said, walking to a wooden box beside the fireplace and removing an object wrapped in oiled cloth. I was away tracking a horse thief, and when I came back, there was nothing left but ashes and the charred bones of my livestock. When he unwrapped the object, Sam found himself looking at a piece of charred wood bearing a crude but unmistakable brand. A V enclosed in a circle, burned deep enough to survive the destruction of everything around it. Voss has always been fond of making sure his victims know exactly who destroyed their lives, Tom continued, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that Sam remembered from their war years. When good men were pushed beyond their breaking point by enemies who confused cruelty with strength, it's not enough for him to win. He needs people to understand that he's untouchable, that crossing him leads to consequences that no law can prevent or punish. Sam studied the burned wood, imagining the scene Tom had described. A man returning home to find everything he had built reduced to ash and bone, with only this calling card left behind to identify the author of his destruction. It was a special kind of cruelty, calculated to break not just a man's livelihood but his spirit. Is that why you became a hermit? Because you were afraid of him? Tom's laugh contained no humor, just the bitter acknowledgement of a man who had learned hard lessons about the limitations of both law and personal revenge. I became a hermit because I was afraid of myself. After I saw what he had done, I spent 6 months tracking him across 3 states, planning exactly how I was going to kill him and making peace with the fact that I would probably hang for it afterward. What stopped you? Sarah, Tom said, glancing at the wedding photograph on the mantel with an expression that mixed love and regret in equal measure. My wife. She made me promise not to become the kind of man who solved problems with murder, even when murder was exactly what the situation called for and what justice demanded. Sam understood. During the war, he had seen good men transform into something else, something necessary but fundamentally different from what they had been before circumstances forced them to choose between survival and principle. Some of them had managed to change back when the fighting stopped, finding their way home to the people they had been before they learned how easy it was to kill. Others had remained trapped in that darker version of themselves, unable or unwilling to lay down weapons that had become extensions of their identity. Sarah's been dead for 8 years, Sam said gently, stating a fact rather than making an argument. Yes, Tom agreed, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had already made up his mind about something important. Which is why I'm going to help you kill Clayton Voss, or die trying to protect the people he wants to destroy. The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war, formal acknowledgement that they were about to cross a line from which there could be no retreat. Outside, the wind had picked up, causing the cabin's walls to creak softly as the building settled into the gravity of what had just been decided. "I'm not asking you to commit murder," Sam said carefully, though he understood that the distinction might prove meaningless once the shooting started. "I'm asking you to help me protect my family and expose Voss for what he really is before he can destroy any more innocent people." Tom walked to another shelf, this one filled with weapons rather than books, and selected a Colt revolver identical to the one Sam carried. He checked its action with the automatic precision of a man who had performed the same ritual thousands of times. Muscle memory from decades of preparation for violence that might come at any moment. "Sometimes protecting family and committing murder are the same thing," Tom said, his voice carrying the pragmatic certainty of someone who had learned that good intentions were worthless without the will to enforce them through whatever means proved necessary. And sometimes a man has to choose between being good and being effective. Sam watched his old friend prepare for battle, noting the careful way Tom selected ammunition, cleaned additional weapons, and packed supplies into a traveling bag that had obviously seen considerable use over the years. This wasn't the preparation of an amateur or someone acting on impulse. This was the methodical preparation of a professional who understood exactly what kind of war they were about to fight and what it would cost them to win. "There's something else you should know," Sam said, remembering Bell's revelation about David's hidden evidence. "Bell thinks David discovered something before he died. Some kind of evidence that would have exposed Voss's entire operation if he'd lived long enough to use it." Tom paused in his preparations, his attention focusing completely on Sam's words with the intensity of a hunter who had just spotted movement in the underbrush. "What kind of evidence?" "Documents of some kind, papers that David kept in a locked box and only looked at when he was sure he wouldn't be overheard or interrupted," Sam said, wishing he had more concrete details to offer. David was upset about something he had learned, something he said was going to change everything if he could figure out what to do about it. If Voss killed David to prevent him from using that evidence, then it's something that could destroy him completely, Tom said, his voice carrying the excitement of a man who had suddenly seen new possibilities in a situation that had previously looked hopeless. "Which means we're not just fighting for your ranch, Sam. We're fighting to finish what your son started." The ride back to Wyoming took 2 full days, and Sam used the time to fill Tom in on everything he knew about Clayton Voss's current operation and the network of corruption that protected it. The cattle baron had expanded significantly since his Texas days, acquiring ranch after ranch through the same combination of legal manipulation and barely concealed threats that had driven Tom from his home a decade earlier. But Voss had also grown more sophisticated, learning from his mistakes and adapting his methods to take advantage of territorial politics and the weakness of local law enforcement. Where once he had relied primarily on violence and intimidation, he now employed teams of lawyers, corrupt officials, and carefully orchestrated financial schemes that were much harder to prove and prosecute than simple theft or murder. "The problem with men like Voss," Tom explained as they rode through the rough country between Colorado and Wyoming, their horses picking their way carefully along trails that could kill an unwary traveler, "is that they're not actually that smart or particularly original in their thinking. They're just patient and completely without conscience, which gives them advantages that honest men can't match." "How so?" "They can wait longer than honest men can afford to wait, and they're willing to do things that honest men can't stomach doing," Tom said, his voice carrying the weary wisdom of someone who had spent decades studying the criminal mind. "They understand that most people will eventually give up if you make their lives difficult enough for long enough, especially if you make it clear that fighting back will only make things worse." "So how do we beat them?" "We become less honest," Tom said simply, the words carrying implications that Sam found both disturbing and strangely liberating. "Not dishonest in the sense of becoming criminals ourselves, but less constrained by rules that prevent good men from being effective against enemies who ignore those rules entirely." Sam considered this as they crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the sprawling valley where the Crawford Ranch lay spread out like a carefully planned settlement in the midst of wilderness that stretched to the horizon in all directions. From this distance, it looked peaceful and prosperous, the kind of place where a man could build a life and raise children in safety and relative comfort. But Sam knew better now. Peace was an illusion that men like Clayton Voss could shatter whenever it served their purposes. And safety was something that had to be fought for and defended rather than something that existed naturally in the world. The ranch below represented 18 years of backbreaking labor and careful planning, but it would mean nothing if he couldn't protect the people who depended on him for their survival. As they rode down toward the ranch buildings, Sam noticed immediately that something was wrong. The front gate stood open, hanging at an odd angle as if it had been forced rather than opened properly. Cattle that should have been in the southern pasture were scattered across the main grazing area, moving restlessly as if something had spooked them recently and they hadn't yet settled back into their normal patterns. Most ominous of all, there was no smoke rising from the ranch house chimney, despite the fact that Belle should have been preparing dinner at this time of day, and the mountain air carried the kind of chill that made a warm fire essential for comfort. Tom had noticed the same detail as Simone, his trained eye cataloging evidence of disturbance with the automatic thoroughness of a man who had learned to read landscapes for signs of trouble. Without a word, both men spurred their horses to a faster pace, covering the remaining distance to the ranch house in a cloud of dust and flying hoofbeats that announced their arrival to anyone who might be watching. They found Belle in the kitchen, sitting at the wooden table Sam had built during his first year on the ranch, when everything was new and the future seemed full of unlimited possibilities. She was unharmed, but clearly shaken, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly as she attempted to pour tea from a pot that rattled against the cup with each movement, creating a sound like distant gunfire that set Sam's nerves on edge. "Belle," Sam said, dismounting quickly and rushing to her side with the kind of urgent concern that only came from genuine fear for someone's safety. "What happened here? Are you hurt?" "They came this morning," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands that spoke of an experience that had tested her courage in ways she hadn't expected. "3 men, including Sheriff Miller. They said they had a warrant to search the property." Sam felt his blood turn cold, understanding immediately that this represented an escalation beyond simple intimidation into outright abuse of legal authority. Sheriff Miller was Clayton Voss's creature, a fact that everyone in the territory understood, but no one could prove convincingly enough to result in his removal from office. If Miller was using his official position to harass Belle, it meant Voss was no longer bothering to maintain even the pretense of operating within the law. It meant the gloves were off and the real war was about to begin in earnest. "What kind of warrant?" Tom asked, introducing himself to Belle with the kind of formal courtesy that seemed almost anachronistic given the circumstances they were discussing. Belle reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded paper, handing it to Sam with obvious reluctance. The document bore all the official seals and signatures that territorial law required for property searches, legal trappings that would impress most people who didn't know what to look for in forged government documents. They claimed someone had reported that David was selling stolen cattle to buyers in Colorado, Belle said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet anger that came from being accused of crimes that everyone involved knew had never been committed. According to the warrant, they needed to search for evidence of illegal sales and forged bills of transfer. Sam read the warrant carefully, his anger building with each line of legal text that had been crafted to sound official, while providing justification for whatever harassment Voss wanted to inflict. The accusations were specific enough to sound credible to people who didn't know David's character, but vague enough to justify searching every building on the ranch and seizing anything that might conceivably be considered evidence. More importantly, they were exactly the kind of charges that would invalidate any claim Belle might have to the property, painting David as a criminal whose illegal activities had forfeited his family's right to the ranch he had worked so hard to maintain and improve. "Did they find anything incriminating?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Belle shook her head with the bitter satisfaction of someone who had been vindicated despite the cost. "Nothing incriminating, because there was nothing to find. David was the most honest man I ever knew, and everyone who actually knew him understood that. But they were very thorough in their search." She paused, her expression growing darker as she remembered details that were clearly painful to recall. "They searched the house, going through every room and overturning furniture as if they were looking for something specific rather than just conducting a general search. They searched the barn, the storage sheds, even the old root cellar behind the main barn where we keep winter supplies." Sam and Tom exchanged glances, both men understanding immediately that the root cellar was exactly where Sam had planned to look for David's hidden evidence. If Voss's men had searched there, it meant either they had found what David had hidden, or David had been clever enough to conceal it in ways that even a determined search couldn't uncover. Did they take anything from the root cellar? Sam asked, though he dreaded the answer. A wooden box, Belle said, her voice carrying the defeat of someone who had watched her last hope disappear. Sheriff Miller claimed it contained forged bills of sale that proved David had been selling stolen cattle. But I know that's impossible, Sam. David never kept anything like that, and he would have told me if he'd been involved in any questionable business dealings. Sam felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Voss hadn't just been planning to steal the ranch through legal manipulation and forged documents. He had been systematically destroying any evidence that could expose his broader criminal enterprise, using his control over local law enforcement to seize David's hidden evidence before it could be used against him. The evidence David found, Sam said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of understanding that came too late to help his son. It wasn't just about our ranch, was it? It was about all of Voss's operations, everything he's been doing for the past 20 years to steal land from people who couldn't fight back effectively. Tom nodded grimly, his expression reflecting the recognition of a man who had seen this pattern before and understood its implications. Which means we're not just dealing with a local land grab anymore, Sam. We're dealing with a criminal organization that has enough political protection to use law enforcement as a weapon against anyone who threatens their interests. Belle looked between the two men with the kind of desperate hope that made Sam's chest ache with the weight of responsibility and the fear that he might not be able to protect the people who depended on him. She was 28 years old, 4 months pregnant, and facing the systematic destruction of everything her husband had built through years of honest labor and careful planning. But instead of the despair that might have been expected under such circumstances, Sam saw determination in her eyes, the kind of fierce resolve that had made her attractive to David in the first place, and that would serve her well in the battles that lay ahead. "What do we do now?" she asked, the question carrying implications that extended far beyond immediate tactics to encompass the kind of life she wanted to build for her unborn child. Tom walked to the kitchen window, studying the ranch buildings with the trained eye of a man who understood defensive positions and could assess the tactical advantages and disadvantages of any potential battlefield. When he turned back to face them, his expression carried the grim satisfaction of a professional soldier who had finally identified his enemy's weakness and was ready to exploit it. "Now we stop playing defense," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded men in situations where failure meant death. "Voss thinks he's won because he's taken David's evidence and corrupted the local law enforcement system, but he's made a crucial mistake that we can use against him." "What kind of mistake?" Sam asked. "He's revealed how deep his network of corruption goes, which means we now know exactly how many people we need to defeat and what methods they're willing to use," Tom replied. "More importantly, he's shown us that he's afraid of something important enough that he was willing to risk using official law enforcement to get his hands on it." Belle leaned forward, her attention focused completely on Tom's words. "What do you think he was afraid of?" "Evidence that could connect him to crimes serious enough to bring federal attention," Tom said. "Murder, large-scale fraud, conspiracy to violate territorial laws. The kind of charges that even his political connections couldn't protect him from if the evidence was compelling enough." Sam felt a spark of hope for the first time since reading Voss's forged letter. "You think David's evidence still exists?" "I think David was smart enough to hide it in more than one place," Tom said. "And I think he was careful enough to make copies, because that's what any intelligent man would do when dealing with information that could get him killed." The sun was setting behind the Bighorn Mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Sam of campfires from the war and the camaraderie that developed between men who faced death together. Somewhere in those mountains, Clayton Voss was probably celebrating what he thought was a decisive victory, confident that he had eliminated the last obstacle to claiming the Crawford Ranch as his own. But Sam knew something about wars that Voss had apparently never learned during his years of preying on people weaker than himself. The most dangerous enemies were not the ones who came at you with overwhelming force and obvious intentions. They were the ones who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The ones who understood that some principles were worth dying for and some injustices could not be tolerated. As darkness settled over the Crawford Ranch like a blanket thrown over the dying embers of a campfire, three people who had been virtual strangers that morning began planning a campaign that would either destroy Clayton Voss completely or see them all destroyed in the attempt to bring justice to a territory where law had been corrupted and honest people lived in fear. The war for the soul of Wyoming Territory was about to begin in earnest, and this time the good men were going to fight as ruthlessly as their enemies. The dawn brought with it a clarity that Sam Crawford had not felt since his son's death. The kind of crystalline understanding that came to soldiers on the morning of decisive battles when all preparations were complete and only action remained. He stood beside the ranch house, watching Tom McKenna check his weapons with the methodical precision of a man who understood that war was won or lost in the details. Each cartridge counted and each moving part tested before lives depended on their function. Bell emerged from the house carrying a leather satchel that contained the few documents they had managed to gather, papers that might prove useful if they lived long enough to present them to honest authorities. Her pregnancy showed more clearly now at 5 months. The curve of her belly, a constant reminder of what they were fighting to protect and what would be lost if they failed in the desperate gamble they were about to undertake. "The federal marshal arrives in Cheyenne tomorrow," she said, her voice tight with nervous energy as she understood their plan's critical timing. "If we can get evidence to him before Voss realizes what we're doing, we might actually have a chance to see justice done." Tom looked up from his rifle, his expression immediately shifting to tactical assessment mode. "Federal marshals can be bought just like anyone else, Bell. We've seen it happen before in Texas and other territories. We need more than just evidence. We need proof so overwhelming that even a corrupt official would be afraid to ignore it because the consequences would destroy his own career." Sam felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like the familiar burden of command he had carried during the war, when young men's lives had depended on his decisions and the margin for error had been measured in heartbeats rather than hours. Every choice from this point forward would determine not just whether they survived the next few days, but whether Bell's child would grow up free from the shadow of Clayton Voss's evil influence. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts, but these were not the measured cadences of enemies approaching for battle. Three riders approached from the east, their horses moving with the urgency of men carrying important news that could not wait for more convenient timing. Sam recognized the lead rider immediately, Johann Muller, the German immigrant who owned the neighboring ranch and had helped Bell during Sam's absence on his journey to find Tom McKenna. Muller dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked like barely contained rage, mixed with the kind of desperation that came from watching helplessly as evil men destroyed everything decent people had worked to build. Behind him rode his two eldest sons, Klaus and Friedrich, both carrying rifles and wearing expressions that suggested they had not come for a social visit or friendly conversation about cattle prices and weather conditions. "Sam," Muller said in his heavily accented English, each word carefully chosen despite the obvious urgency of his message, "we must talk immediately and about something terrible that has happened. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about this situation and the scope of Voss's criminal enterprise." Tom's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, a reflex developed through decades of survival in situations where the difference between life and death could be measured in fractions of seconds. But Sam gestured for calm, recognizing that Muller was an ally whose own family had suffered under Voss's threats and who had every reason to want the cattle baron destroyed as completely as possible. "What is it, Johann? What's happened now?" Muller glanced toward Bell, then back at Sam, clearly uncomfortable with sharing bad news in front of a pregnant woman who had already endured more tragedy and uncertainty than any person should be forced to bear. But Bell stepped forward with the determination that had sustained her through months of grief and uncertainty, her chin raised in the stubborn gesture that reminded Sam painfully of David's own refusal to back down from difficult situations. "Tell us," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to know whatever truth was being discussed. "Whatever it is, I need to know. This affects my child's future as much as anyone's, and I won't be protected from information that might help us win this war." Muller Mueller nodded reluctantly, his respect for Bell's courage warring with his protective instincts toward women and children caught in the crossfire of conflicts they had not chosen. Last night, men came to my ranch while we were sleeping. They took my youngest boy, Heinrich. He is only 14 years old, Sam. Just a child who never harmed anyone and whose only crime was being born to a family that refused to surrender to Voss's intimidation. Sam felt cold understanding wash over him like ice water, the tactical implications of this new development becoming clear with sickening clarity. This was Voss's response to their investigation and the threat it posed to his criminal organization. His way of ensuring that no one would be willing to help them when the final confrontation came and lives hung in the balance. Did they leave any message? Any indication of what they want in return for the boy's safety? Sheriff Miller came to my ranch this morning with official papers, Mueller said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage that spoke of a father driven to desperation. He says Heinrich was caught stealing cattle from Voss's ranch, that there are witnesses who will testify to his guilt. They are holding him in the town jail until a territorial judge can arrive for trial, but we both know there will be no fair trial for a boy whose father stands against Clayton Voss. Tom McKenna stepped forward, his professional instincts taking over as he began to assess the tactical implications of this new development with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work. It's a trap, Sam. Voss is using the boy as bait to force us into town where he can control the situation, choose the battlefield, and eliminate us on ground that favors his superior numbers and political connections. I know it's a trap, Sam replied, his voice carrying the grim certainty of a man who had walked into deliberate ambushes before and survived through careful planning, superior firepower, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect innocent people. But we can't leave that boy in Voss's hands. You know what will happen to him if we don't act, and I won't have another death on my conscience when there's something I can do to prevent it. Belle placed her hand on Sam's arm, her touch gentle but insistent in the way that women had of conveying urgent information without speaking directly. There's something else, something I should have told you earlier but wasn't sure about until this morning when I had time to think clearly about what David said before he died. All eyes turned to her as she reached into her satchel and produced a small brass key, the kind used for strong boxes and document safes in the more sophisticated banking establishments that were beginning to appear in territorial capitals. The key was polished smooth from handling, suggesting it had been carried regularly by someone who considered it important enough to keep close at hand. The night David died, he gave me this, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of revelation that could change everything they thought they knew about their tactical situation. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone I trusted completely, someone who would know what to do with what it opened and how to use it effectively against our enemies. Sam took the key, feeling its weight in his palm like a talisman that might change the balance of power in their favor if they could figure out how to use it properly. The metal was warm from Belle's body heat, and he could see David's initials scratched into one side in the careful script his son had learned from his mother. What does it open? Did David tell you anything specific about where it should be used or what kind of documents might be involved? A safety deposit box at the Cattlemen's Bank in Cheyenne, Belle said, her words carrying the excitement of someone who had finally found hope in a situation that had seemed hopeless. David opened the account 6 months ago, paying the fees with money he earned from selling horses to cavalry units stationed at Fort Laramie. He never told me what he put inside the box, but he said it was insurance, something that would protect our family if his worst fears about Voss came true. Tom's eyes sharpened with the intensity of a hunter who had just spotted his quarry, the professional excitement of a man who understood the significance of what they had just learned. David made copies of whatever evidence he found. He was smart enough to realize that keeping originals hidden on the ranch was too dangerous, so he put duplicates somewhere that Voss couldn't reach them, even if he discovered the location of the primary hiding place. Sam felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place with almost audible clicks, the tactical situation becoming clearer even as it grew more complex. David had been more careful and forward-thinking than any of them had realized, planning for contingencies that his father hadn't even considered, and preparing defenses against enemies who might prove more dangerous than anyone imagined. The bank is in Cheyenne, Sam said, thinking aloud about distances and timing while mentally calculating what it would take to reach the territorial capital and return with evidence that could destroy Voss's entire operation. If we ride hard and change horses at way stations, we could be there by tomorrow evening. But that means leaving Heinrich in jail for another full day. What about my boy? Mueller asked, his voice carrying the desperation of a father whose child was in mortal danger and whose protective instincts warred with the practical necessities of a complex military operation. How long can a 14-year-old survive in Voss's custody when that man has already proven he's willing to murder anyone who threatens his interests? Tom McKenna studied the older German immigrant with the calculating gaze of a man weighing tactical options against moral imperatives, professional experience against human compassion. How many men does Voss have in town right now? Do we know their positions and capabilities? Sheriff Miller and his deputy, plus maybe 6 or 7 hired guns who have been drifting into the territory over the past few weeks, Mueller replied, his information reflecting the careful observation of a man who understood that survival on the frontier required constant awareness of potential threats. But the town council supports Voss because he brings money and cattle contracts that keep local businesses profitable. Most people will not help us, even if they know we are fighting for justice, because they're more afraid of economic hardship than they are of moral compromise. We'll need a diversion, Tom said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had planned similar operations during his years as a Texas Ranger, when legal authority had to be backed up with tactical superiority and the willingness to fight. Something that draws Voss's attention and his men away from the jail while we get the boy out safely, but also something that doesn't put innocent townspeople at risk. Sam looked at the assembled faces, seeing in them the same mixture of fear and determination that he remembered from his war years when good men prepared to do dangerous things for reasons that transcended personal safety and immediate self-interest. This was the moment when abstract principles became concrete actions, when moral beliefs had to be backed up with courage and the willingness to sacrifice. I have an idea, he said slowly, his mind working through the tactical implications of what he was considering, but it's going to require splitting our forces, and some of us might not survive what comes next. We're talking about open warfare against a man who has the sheriff's office, most of the town council, and probably half the territorial legislature in his pocket. Tom nodded grimly, his expression reflecting years of experience with situations where good men had to take risks that peace never demanded, and where survival depended on superior planning rather than superior numbers. Wars always require good people to accept dangers that reasonable men would avoid. What do you have in mind? Sam walked to his horse and removed a detailed territorial map from his saddlebags, spreading the worn leather document on the wooden table where Belle had been preparing breakfast in what seemed like another lifetime. With his finger, he traced routes and positions that might give them the tactical advantage they needed against superior numbers and political protection. Belle takes the key to Cheyenne and gets David's evidence to the federal marshal. He began, ignoring her immediate protest and the flash of anger that crossed her features. Johann and his sons create a diversion here at the ranch, something big enough and threatening enough to draw Voss's men away from town and give us the window we need to rescue Heinrich. What kind of diversion are you thinking about? Mueller asked, his tactical mind already working through possibilities, even as his fatherly heart focused on the danger to his youngest son. Fire, Sam said simply, the word carrying implications that made everyone present understand the scope of what he was proposing. Voss burned Tom's ranch in Texas 10 years ago, destroyed everything a good man had built through 20 years of honest work. Time we return the favor by burning his cattle operation here. But we make sure it looks like we're all involved in the attack, so his men come running to defend what he values most. Tom studied the map with professional interest, his experience with similar operations evident in the way he immediately grasped the tactical advantages and potential complications of what Sam was suggesting. While they're dealing with the fire and trying to organize a defense of his ranch, we slip into town from the opposite direction and get the boy out of jail. But that still leaves us outnumbered and surrounded when they realize what happened and start looking for revenge. Not if we time it right and choose our battlefield carefully, Sam replied, his finger moving to mark positions around the town that offered tactical advantages to defenders who understood how to use terrain effectively. There's a narrow canyon between Voss's ranch and the town, a place where the trail winds between rock walls that are too steep for horses to climb. If we can force them to come through there in the dark, we can use the terrain to even the odds and make their superior numbers work against them. Belle shook her head with the stubbornness that reminded Sam painfully of David's own refusal to back down from fights he considered important. I'm not running away to Cheyenne while you fight this battle without me, Sam. This is my fight too. My responsibility as much as anyone's. My child's future depends on what happens here, and I won't hide behind other people's courage while they risk their lives for my family's safety. Your child's future depends on you staying alive long enough to raise him, Sam replied with the gentle firmness of a man who had learned when compromise was possible and when it represented a betrayal of everyone depending on his judgment. And the only way any of us survive this confrontation is if we get that evidence to someone with the authority and integrity to act on it effectively. Dead heroes don't raise children or build the kind of world we want to leave behind. The argument that followed was brief but intense, with Belle insisting that she could take care of herself and contribute meaningfully to the tactical situation, while Sam remained equally insistent that some risks were too great to take when innocent lives hung in the balance and the margin for error had disappeared completely. In the end, it was Tom who settled the matter with the practical wisdom of someone who had commanded men in life or death situations, where emotional considerations had to be balanced against tactical necessities and the greater good. The lady goes to Cheyenne, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of professional experience and hard-won wisdom. But not alone and not without protection. One of Muller's sons escorts her there and back, someone young enough to ride fast and change horses frequently, but old enough and experienced enough to fight effectively if they encounter trouble along the way. Klaus Muller stepped forward immediately, his young face reflecting the kind of determined courage that reminded Sam of soldiers he had known during the war who had volunteered for dangerous missions because they understood the stakes involved. I'll take her safely to Cheyenne and back, Mr. Crawford. You have my word on that, and my father raised me to understand what a man's word means on the frontier. And so it was decided, with the kind of grim finality that marked all irreversible decisions in dangerous times. As the sun climbed higher into the Wyoming sky, their small group began the process of dividing into separate missions that would either save Heinrich Müller, destroy Clayton Voss's criminal organization, and secure justice for David's murder, or see them all dead before another sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Belle departed first, accompanied by Klaus Muller, whose serious demeanor and careful attention to weapons and supplies marked him as someone who understood the gravity of their mission. They rode towards Cheyenne carrying with them not just the hopes of everyone who remained behind, but the key to evidence that might finally bring federal justice to a territory where local law had been corrupted by money and fear. Sam watched them disappear over the eastern ridge, their horses moving at the steady pace that would cover the greatest distance while preserving the animal's strength for the return journey. Then he turned his attention to the preparations that would determine whether he lived to see his grandchild born and grew up in a world where justice meant something more than political convenience. The plan they had developed was inherently dangerous, requiring precise timing, superior tactical execution, and no small amount of luck to succeed against enemies who held most of the advantages in terms of numbers, political protection, and knowledge of local terrain. But it was their only chance to rescue Heinrich while simultaneously destroying the criminal organization that had murdered David and threatened to destroy everything the Crawford family had built through years of honest labor. Johann Muller and his remaining son Friedrich began gathering materials for the fire that would serve as their diversion, collecting hay, kerosene, and other flammable materials that would create a blaze visible for miles across the open prairie and guaranteed to bring Voss's men running to defend property they valued more than human life. Their faces reflected the grim satisfaction of men who had finally found a way to strike back against enemies who had terrorized their families for too long, but also the sober understanding that what they were about to do would make them permanent enemies of powerful people who did not forgive or forget threats to their interests. Tom McKenna spent his time checking equipment and studying detailed approaches to the town jail, His professional training taking over as he calculated angles of attack, potential complications, and retreat routes that might save their lives when the shooting started, and tactical plans met the harsh reality of combat conditions. He worked with professional thoroughness born from years of dangerous work, long before the first shot was fired or the first tactical decision was made under pressure that could cloud judgment and lead to fatal mistakes. As afternoon faded into evening and the time for action approached with inexorable certainty, Sam found himself thinking about David and the legacy he had tried to leave for his unborn child. His son had been braver than any of them had realized, gathering evidence against Voss despite knowing the risks involved and the likelihood that discovery would mean death. Now it fell to Sam to finish what David had started, to ensure that the sacrifice had not been in vain and that Bell's child would inherit more than just land and cattle, but also the knowledge that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The attack began at midnight, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds that had moved in from the mountains, and darkness provided the cover they needed for their desperate gambit against superior numbers. Johann Müller's incendiary devices had been planted throughout Voss's cattle operation with the precision of a military engineer, designed to create maximum confusion and property damage while minimizing harm to innocent animals caught in the crossfire. The first explosion lit the night sky like an artificial sunrise, followed quickly by others that spread fire across hay stores, equipment sheds, and office buildings with devastating effectiveness. Within minutes, the entire complex was ablaze, flames reaching toward the sky with a roar that could be heard for miles and creating a glow that would be visible from town. Sam and Tom used the confusion and the attention focused on the distant fire to approach the town jail from the rear, moving through shadows with the practiced stealth of men who had learned to survive by remaining unseen by enemies who would kill them without hesitation if discovered. The jail was a simple wooden structure reinforced with iron bars, defended by a single deputy who was more interested in watching the distant fire and speculating about its cause than in guarding his prisoner with the attention that professional duty required. Tom's approach was swift and silent, a quick blow to the deputy's head with the butt of his rifle that left the man unconscious but alive, demonstrating the kind of precise violence that achieved tactical objectives without unnecessary brutality. Sam retrieved the keys from the deputy's belt and opened Heinrich's cell, finding the boy frightened but physically unharmed, his young face reflecting relief and gratitude that made the risks they were taking seem worthwhile. "Where is my father?" Heinrich whispered as they prepared to leave the jail, his voice carrying the kind of fear that came from being helpless in the hands of evil men who had no compunction about hurting children to achieve their goals. "Safe and waiting for you," Sam replied quietly, his voice carrying the reassurance of someone who understood what the boy had endured. "But we need to move quickly and quietly. Can you ride hard if necessary?" The boy nodded with the kind of determined courage that reminded Sam of his own son at the same age, and they slipped out of the jail into the night, three shadows moving toward horses they had hidden in the alley behind the blacksmith's shop, where the sound of their hoofbeats would be muffled by the building's bulk. For a moment, it seemed their plan might actually work, that they would escape with Heinrich before Voss realized he had been outmaneuvered by men he had underestimated. The distant fire continued to burn, drawing attention and resources away from the town, and the streets remained empty of the patrols that might have discovered their presence. Then Sheriff Müller appeared at the end of the alley, his gun drawn and pointed directly at Sam's chest, with the steady aim of a man who had killed before and felt no hesitation about doing so again. "Well, well," Miller said with the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he had won a victory that would secure his position with Clayton Voss. "Sam Crawford, the famous war hero turned cattle thief and arsonist. Clayton's going to be real pleased when I bring you in, dead or alive as the situation requires." Tom McKenna moved with the lightning reflexes that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work, his gun clearing its holster and firing before Miller could react to the threat from an unexpected direction. The corrupt sheriff fell backward into the dust, his weapon unfired, and his crooked career ended by a bullet between the eyes that demonstrated Tom's skill with firearms. "Move fast," Tom said urgently, knowing that the gunshot would bring more enemies running and that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before this place is crawling with the Voss's men, and we need to be long gone before they organize a proper pursuit." They mounted their horses and rode hard for the canyon where they had planned to make their defensive stand, Heinrich clinging to Sam's saddle with the desperate strength of a boy who understood that his life depended on the skill and courage of the men who had risked everything to save him from whatever fate Voss had planned. Behind them, the town erupted in shouts and confusion as word spread that Sheriff Miller was dead and his prisoner had been freed by unknown gunmen who had disappeared into the night like ghosts. Lanterns appeared in windows throughout the town, and soon the sound of pursuing hoofbeats echoed across the prairie like thunder rolling down from the mountains. The canyon was exactly where Sam remembered it from his earlier reconnaissance, a narrow passage between towering rock walls that would force their enemies to approach in single file and eliminate the numerical advantage that Voss's men possessed in open terrain. Tom had spent part of the afternoon preparing defensive positions among the boulders that littered the canyon floor, places where a few men with rifles could hold off superior numbers if they were willing to fight with the kind of desperate courage that came from protecting something more important than their own lives. "This is where we make our stand," Tom said as they took up their positions among the rocks, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced similar situations before and understood what was required for survival. "If we can hold them here until dawn, Johann's diversion will have bought Bell enough time to reach the federal marshal and return with help." Sam checked his ammunition and settled behind a boulder that provided protection while allowing him a clear field of fire down the canyon approach, the tactical position he had selected during their earlier planning session. Heinrich crouched beside him, unarmed but determined to do whatever was necessary to help the men who had saved his life. The first of Voss's riders appeared at the canyon mouth just as the moon emerged from behind the clouds, their horses picking their way carefully along the rocky path that offered treacherous footing in the uncertain light. Sam could see Clayton Voss himself in the lead, his expensive clothes torn and soot-stained from fighting the fires that had destroyed his cattle operation and cost him a significant portion of his accumulated wealth. "Crawford!" Voss shouted, his cultured voice cracking with rage that spoke of a man who had never learned to accept defeat gracefully. "You've burned my ranch and murdered my sheriff. Come out and face the consequences like a man instead of hiding behind rocks like a coward." Sam's answer was a rifle shot that knocked the hat from Voss's head and sent the cattle baron diving for cover behind the nearest boulder, a demonstration that the men he was hunting were armed, dangerous, and willing to fight rather than surrender to the kind of justice that corrupt officials dispensed. The battle that followed was brief but brutal, gunfire echoing through the canyon like the wrath of angry gods as two groups of desperate men fought for control of Heinrich's freedom, David's legacy, and the future of honest law enforcement in Wyoming territory. Tom McKenna proved that his reputation as a marksman was well-deserved, his rifle accounting for 3 of Voss's men in the first 5 minutes of fighting, each shot placed with the precision that came from years of practice and the absolute necessity of making every bullet count when ammunition was limited. Sam's military training served him well, his shots precise and deadly as he eliminated threats to the boy they had risked everything to save. His experience with combat under pressure, allowing him to remain calm and focused despite the chaos of battle raging around their position. But numbers began to tell as more of Voss's men arrived and took up positions among the rocks at the canyon mouth, and soon bullets were chipping stone from the boulders around their defensive position with increasing frequency and accuracy. Sam realized that they might hold out until dawn if their ammunition lasted, but not much longer than that, and that Bell's success in reaching the federal marshal would mean nothing if none of them survived to see justice finally done and Voss's criminal organization destroyed. That was when the federal marshal arrived with the cavalry charge that changed everything. The sound of 20 mounted soldiers echoed through the canyon as they appeared behind Voss's position, their uniforms marking them as representatives of legitimate federal law enforcement rather than corrupt local officials who could be bought or intimidated. Belle rode among them, her face showing the strain of her desperate journey to Cheyenne and back, but her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do, despite the dangers and obstacles that had stood in her way. "Clayton Voss!" The federal marshal's voice boomed across the battlefield with the authority of legitimate government power. "By authority of the United States government and the evidence presented by Mrs. Crawford, You are under arrest for murder, cattle rustling, land fraud, conspiracy to violate federal territorial statutes, and corruption of local law enforcement. The battle ended as abruptly as it had begun, Voss's men throwing down their weapons when faced with federal troops who could not be bought, intimidated, or influenced by local political considerations. Voss himself tried to run, spurring his horse toward a narrow trail that led out of the canyon, but his mount stumbled on loose rock and threw him heavily to the ground, where he was captured by soldiers who had no patience for his protests about political connections and territorial rights. But as the federal marshal examined the documents Bell had retrieved from David's safety deposit box, his expression grew increasingly grave. He pulled Sam aside, away from the celebrating soldiers. "Crawford, your son discovered something far more dangerous than we anticipated," the marshal said quietly. "These aren't just records of local corruption. Look at these payment ledgers, money flowing from Voss to territorial senators, federal land office officials, even judges in Washington. This is a nationwide conspiracy to steal homestead lands." Sam felt the blood drain from his face. "You're saying David died because he uncovered a federal conspiracy?" "I'm saying your son's evidence is going to bring down corrupt officials we never suspected existed. This reaches all the way to Congress." The marshal's voice carried both admiration and concern. Voss was just one tentacle of something much larger. Bell approached, having overheard. "Does this mean we're still in danger?" "It means you've just handed us the evidence to clean house in Washington," the marshal replied. "Your husband didn't just save Wyoming territory. He may have saved the entire homestead system." As dawn broke over Wyoming territory, Sam Crawford stood among the rocks where he had expected to die, watching federal marshals load Clayton Voss into a prisoner wagon that would carry him to territorial capital for trial and almost certain execution. Heinrich Mueller ran across the canyon floor to embrace his father, their reunion serving as a reminder of why good men sometimes had to fight for principles that transcended personal safety and immediate self-interest. Belle approached across the rocky ground, moving carefully because of her pregnancy, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen justice finally prevail over corruption and evil. In her hand, she carried documents from the safety deposit box, evidence that David had carefully and systematically gathered to expose the full scope of Voss's criminal enterprise. "David documented everything," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of pride in her husband's courage and sorrow that he had not lived to see the fruits of his dangerous work. Names, dates, amounts of money stolen, even photographs of forged documents and maps showing properties that were illegally seized. The federal marshal says it's enough evidence to convict not just Voss, but everyone who helped him steal land from honest families across 3 territories. Tom McKenna holstered his gun and walked over to where Sam was standing, his lined features showing quiet vindication after settling an old score that had haunted him for 10 years. "Your son was a better man than any of us realized, Sam. He died protecting people he'd never met, families who would have lost everything they'd worked for if his evidence hadn't survived to expose the truth." Sam nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying since David's funeral, the crushing burden of failure and inadequacy that had threatened to destroy his sense of purpose and self-worth. His son had not died in vain, and the Crawford Ranch would remain in family hands for the grandchild who would be born into a world where justice had finally triumphed over corruption, greed, and the abuse of power. As the prisoner wagon disappeared over the eastern horizon, carrying Clayton Voss toward the fate he had earned through years of evil, Sam helped Belle into the saddle for the ride home to the ranch that was finally, truly secure. She was exhausted from her desperate journey to Cheyenne and the emotional strain of seeing justice done, but her child was safe. Her ranch was protected by federal law, and her husband's murderer would face the hangman's noose. The war for Wyoming territory was over, won not through superior firepower or political influence, but through the determination of ordinary people who had refused to accept that evil men could triumph simply because they were willing to do things that good people found morally repugnant. The aftermath unfolded with the swift efficiency of federal justice finally unleashed. Within 2 weeks, arrest warrants were issued for 3 territorial senators and a federal judge. Voss's execution came 8 weeks later, witnessed by the families he had destroyed. His criminal network, deprived of its head and federal protection, crumbled like a house built on sand. The trials that followed made national headlines. David's meticulously gathered evidence became the foundation for the largest corruption investigation in territorial history. Federal oversight was established to prevent such systematic abuse from ever taking root again. 6 months after that decisive night in the canyon, Sam Crawford stood in the cemetery where both his son and Clayton Voss were buried, though in graves that reflected the vast moral distance between them. David's headstone was made of polished granite, paid for by grateful ranchers whose families had been saved by his evidence. Voss's grave was marked only by a simple wooden cross, unadorned and already weathering in the harsh Wyoming climate. But Sam's attention was focused on more pleasant matters, specifically the healthy baby boy that Belle held in her arms as they stood together in the afternoon sunshine that painted the mountains gold and promised a future full of possibility and hope. David Samuel Crawford, named for his father and grandfather, would grow up on the ranch that had been preserved through sacrifice, courage, and the unwillingness of good people to surrender to evil when the stakes were too high to accept defeat. He would learn to work the land that his grandfather had claimed from wilderness. And he would inherit not just property, but the knowledge that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. Tom McKenna had chosen to remain in Wyoming permanently, taking up residence in a comfortable cabin that Sam had built for him near the main ranch house. His skills as a former Texas Ranger proved valuable in maintaining order in a territory where federal law was still establishing its authority over local corruption, and his friendship provided Sam with the companionship of someone who understood that peace was something that had to be constantly defended rather than simply enjoyed. Johann Muller's family prospered on their ranch, their cattle growing fat on grass that was no longer threatened by the predations of criminal organizations. And Heinrich had grown into a fine young man whose courage during the rescue had earned him the respect of everyone who knew the full story of that night. And Belle had found a new kind of happiness in motherhood, her son's laughter filling the ranch house with joy that had been absent since David's death, proving that life continued and hope endured even after the darkest tragedies. As autumn painted the Bighorn Mountains in shades of gold and red that reminded Sam of better days, he sat on the porch of his ranch house watching his grandson take his first uncertain steps across the wooden planks that David had laid with such care and pride. The circle was complete, the legacy was secure, and the land that had demanded so much blood and sacrifice would continue to nurture the family that had claimed it through determination, honor, and the willingness to fight for what was right. The frontier was changing, becoming more civilized with each passing year as federal law established its authority, and corrupt men learned that their actions carried consequences they could not escape through money or political influence. But the lessons learned during the war against Clayton Voss would not be forgotten, passed down from generation to generation as reminders that freedom was never free, and that good men sometimes had to fight for the right to live in peace. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the valley, hunting with the patient persistence that had always characterized life on the frontier. And Sam Crawford smiled, knowing that he had done his duty to his son, his family, and the principle that honest work deserved protection from those who preferred to take rather than earn what they wanted from life. The war was over, the victory was complete, and the future belonged to those with the courage to defend it against whatever challenges might emerge from the vast wilderness that still surrounded their small outposts of civilization.